Well, joining me now from Perth is the former Minister for Indigenous Australians, Ken Wyatt. And Ken Wyatt, thanks for your time. I will start then by asking...
It's good to be with you.
I'll start by asking you about the sad death of Jim Molan. Do you have any thoughts over his passing, the sort of colleague he was, the sort of man he was?
Yes, I've always enjoyed the company of Jim whenever I spoke with him, and he is a significant loss to this nation in terms of his compassion in regards to the service he gave, but more about his tactical thinking and strategic thinking in terms of what Australia need to do to ensure that it was in a safe environment, and that the book that he wrote was very impressive and interesting. I was saddened to hear the news this morning that a close colleague has gone.
And this news came after I invited you on. Obviously, I've invited you on to talk about the Voice to Parliament. The government keeps saying that you took a proposal for the Voice to Cabinet twice, to the Morrison Cabinet. Can you take us through when that was and why it didn't get through?
Well, actually, it was taken through to Cabinet for Cabinet to consider the activities that I needed to undertake. But my key message, which I made publicly, was always, let's focus on a local voice and then a regional voice. And I wanted to delay the national voice by about 18 months because I wanted to consolidate both the regional and local voices, because Aboriginal voices have got to be heard if we want to change the lives, the communities in which they are, and the outcomes that we seek, as all governments have done for the last 30, 40 years.
So that local and regional voice, could they have occurred before a referendum? Is that what you're saying? And what was your original timeframe?
Well, my original timeframe was to take legislation forward to establish the local voices and regional, because already across Australia there are a number of local and regional voices that state and territory governments use. What we were doing was looking at the interaction with the Australian government, but ultimately a partnership with state and territory governments and local government, because it's in your community that you see change happen. You don't see it from Canberra, you don't see it from Perth. It has to be on the ground, and that's why I want to involve Aboriginal families and community leaders in solving problems and providing solutions through a co-design, co-decide approach, which meant that they were involved and they would own the work that had to be undertaken. They were involved, they understood, and they made sure that it would be there in perpetuity, not just for the term of a government.
So I just want to get my head around this, and the viewers' heads around this. So the government keeps saying you took a Voice to Parliament twice to Cabinet. Were you taking, from what you're telling me, local and regional voice with a referendum to come down the track? You never took a sort of a national voice proposal to Cabinet. Is that right?
Well, the report that I commissioned with Tom and Marcia leading it, and 3 significant groups focusing on a national voice, a regional voice and a local voice, had in place a number of recommendations. And it was my intent, given the challenge of COVID, because COVID certainly intervened in that period of work that we were doing, but making sure that when I took it to my colleagues, that they understood the steps that I wanted to go through, that legislation was one of my first steps to ensure that we demonstrated that there was an effective model in which Aboriginal people could determine their lives, and then ultimately a national voice. But I was still committed to constitutional recognition, and I had those discussions on an ongoing basis with many of my Cabinet colleagues, but equally with a number of backbenchers who were interested in helping move this debate forward, creating the understanding out in broader Australia. It really was going back to the nub of how Aboriginal communities once operated, and that was families locally determined how they would move forward, how they would engage, who they would engage with, and make sure that there were better outcomes on the ground. And we've moved away from that. We've moved to focusing on organisations. I wanted to take it back to what was a cultural construct of using elders and families within those communities to work through to achieve better outcomes.
Mr. White, was it kicked down the road because of COVID, or was it because of internal opposition?
No, the internal opposition wasn't an issue at all. I was continuing with the work that we had agreed to. Part of the process was making sure that we listened to our people on the ground, and Tom and Marcia led an incredible process with the National Indigenous Australians Agency to get the views of so many people. And when you read the report, there are extracts where people say, I am tired of being told what I have to do. What I want to do is listen and then be involved. And that's the strategy that I talked through with colleagues over the 3 years I was working on this, because we have to get it right. And Linda Burney, who is now the current minister, will have the same challenge of getting it right, because if we don't get this right, we will have the naysayers say, oh, you've created another ATSEC. We didn't want to create another ATSEC.
Was Peter Dutton an internal opponent of The Voice, or a sceptic, or was he broadly supportive?
No, Peter was supportive. Look, I had good discussions with Peter, not only on The Voice, but a range of other Indigenous issues. And what I want people to remember is that I took a number of key initiatives to Cabinet, and my Cabinet colleagues endorsed those, including the very ambitious plan for closing the gap, where what the strategy was for every minister around Cabinet to take on responsibility within their portfolios on Aboriginal programs and initiatives, but equally for National Cabinet to sign up, and then every state and territory Cabinet to sign up, which we achieved. And it was extraordinary, because I worked with 51 Aboriginal peak organisations, ministers for Aboriginal affairs from each jurisdiction, and senior public servants. A great outcome for Indigenous Australians, but we'll see what the proof is in 3-4 years' time, because we should see evidence of improvement in the closing of the gaps.
Sure. Look, what do you think are the chances of The Voice getting up at referendum this year?
Well, look, when I wandered through Perth, or when I was in Canberra or Sydney, I've had people come up to me and say, mate, just tell them to get on with it. Tell them that our generation want it to happen. We believe that it's fair for Aboriginal people to have a say in their own affairs and the direction they're taking. Those who are the naysayers say to me, well, I don't know what the structure is. I'm not sure that I can back it without the detail. But the detail, as I've said previously, is in the final report that Tom and Marcia provided me, that, as I said, I took to Cabinet to seek the next steps that I wanted to take.
That is Peter Dutton, right? He's saying there's not enough detail. So when you just spoke then about naysayers, I'm not sure about the structure, I don't know about the detail. It sounds like you were talking about Peter Dutton.
No, I'm talking about a lot of people.
But isn't he one of them?
Well, at the moment, from what I've seen of Peter's letter, you would have to say that he was a naysayer. But I know that in discussions I had with Peter about what the model should look like, with a focus on local, my recollection is he had no issue with that.
All right. Well, just, Mr. White, just briefly, we're nearly out of time. I just want to ask you a couple of things. You're on the working group now. What are you trying to achieve? And can you give us a practical example of how Voice to Parliament will make a difference? Just any example in health or education, how it would actually work in effect?
Well, let me use a simple one, water. Across this nation, there are Aboriginal communities that have water that is the colour of milk, have uranium salts, nitrate salts, or when you look in their water tanks, are full of algae and dead birds sitting on the top of the water. Communities raise their concerns about water quality and want something done about it. One community in particular that comes to mind showed me their milky water. We had that remedied because it was a case of listening and acting. What they're frustrated is the lack of action when they raise issues and want change to occur.
Now, finally, I just wanted to ask you about an incident mentioned in Nikki Sava's recent book about Scott Morrison. Not a very complimentary book about Scott Morrison, I have to say. But it talks about where Scott Morrison and Stuart Robert approach you and put one hand on each of your shoulders and pray for you in the job. I think a lot of Australians would see that as pretty unusual, but you didn't have a problem with it when you spoke to the author about that.
No, actually I was fascinated that Nicky had that information, because that was a very private meeting that there were a group in, and when that occurred, I know the faith of both men, so I didn't have an issue with it at all. When you see the intent, and they were praying that I would succeed in the challenges that I had within my portfolio, and it was nothing more than wanting to fundamentally wish me every strength and resilience in the challenges that are often complex in the lives of Indigenous Australians, because what the Commonwealth provides is funding, but it doesn't deliver directly the programs and services on the ground that we need to close the gaps, because states and territories have those control levers.